Well, Bill, I'd like to speak with you a little bit about your favorite topic, Japan. You certainly come as an expert on that, and I have some interest in all of in that particular subject, having visited there briefly and had the opportunity to interact with the Maryknoll missionaries in Japan, a very impressive group of people. And I suppose in my conversations with them, I got some feel for their perceptions, at least, sure, of Japan. A lot of these people, well, they all know the language and they've lived in that culture, and so I was very interested in their perceptions. And part of it, I suppose, is that their sense of the psychological isolation of Japan, that how hard it is for them to break into the culture. Even after many years there, it's difficult for them to be accepted or to really understand what the Japanese people are thinking about. And that puts me in mind of the general topic of Japan and international relationships. And perhaps we might look a little bit at that history of how Japan has gotten to this state and how all of that has developed. So maybe can you rehearse a bit of that history for me?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Jim. It's a extremely important topic. It's one that seems to take, in some respects, a little bit of a setback or a secondary place to business and some other elements. But the international relations of Japan are a product of several generations. For example, one of the first things I guess I would point out is a geographical aspect. Japan, being an island country, has developed over the years what several people have referred to as an island mentality. Shimaguni Konjo, a concept of seeing themselves as islanders with a very special quality or feature to that island.
I know some of their mythology plays to that, too. They see themselves as descendants from the sun goddess, and therefore having a very special place. There's almost like a civil religion that seems to play into that notion that they are a special people, God's people. Of course, that's not foreign to us in the United States with our notion of the civil religion and we being God's chosen people here in the United States. So we ought to be able to understand it, but it functions very effectively in Japan.
Many countries have similar notions, but historically, Japan's word for government and for religion were the same word. Matsurigoto was used synonymously for both. But in the 17th century, the mid-17th century, Japan intentionally separated herself from the rest of the world, hoping to unify her culture and country, and to ward off potential dangers coming from outside pressures. For nearly a little over 2 centuries, actually, she remained separate with only minimal contact in special locations. That period of separation, that period of, as they called, sakoku, or closed country, gave her the opportunity to develop internally very effectively. It also presented some problems in terms of ability, or perhaps I should say inability, to interrelate and work well with the outside world.
Bill, can I take you back to before that period?
Yes.
And some of the relationships between Japan and the rest of the world? I know there's a tremendous Chinese influence
very strong.
in Japan that goes back earlier. I think it was around the 9th century when they adopted the Chinese characters for their alphabet. And so maybe that China connection needs to be put in there.
The distinction you make is a very important one. I was thinking largely in terms of the Western contact, but Japan has owed a great deal to China. Historically, not only the language in terms of the written character, but also Buddhism, also Confucianism, a great deal of attitudes towards family and society are carryovers from the continent itself. And this kind of continental influence has been felt in so many different ways in Japan. There are centuries of borrowing, centuries of interaction that way, but always in the form of accepting what Japan wants, refining and developing those features to the Japanese benefit and interest.
They've been very adaptable that way,
yes,
haven't they?
Yes.
Very good adapters.
Adapters, the word often is used, imitators. I think adapters is a better characterization for it because it shows the selectivity factor.
Yeah, so then we get into that period where
that precedes the Western influence.
Then when we start with the Western influence, we see a great deal of isolation on purpose in order to strengthen themselves internally. And then we're into the 19th century. There's an event in 1853 that the United States entered this whole thing, dispatching large part of its naval fleet under the command of Commodore Perry to force, evidently, some trade, to force Japan to open up. It's a very interesting part of our American history that we really should remember, and probably plays into the situation today, where this idea of forcing our way into their markets. There must be some Japanese memory of this event in 1853 with Commodore Perry.
There is. Commodore Perry, brother of the famous Lake Erie Perry, went to Japan, along with, I should add, a number of British, French, and Russian naval personnel, attempting to open Japan to trade and to Western relations. By chance, Commodore Perry was the individual that succeeded in breaking down those barriers, forming what the Japanese have called unequal treaties, treaties which tended to put Japan at a disadvantage. But in almost good Japanese fashion, what happened, they accepted the treaties and then immediately set to work to rectify the unequal parts of those treaties, succeeding in that by around the turn of the century.
Did they feel forced into that? I know in 1858, I think they made a trade treaty. They felt forced.
They felt forced
through military force?
The so-called black ships, the naval armament of the U.S. was part of that direction. Now, there is another side, however, to that. In terms of interpretation, they're called unequal treaties, and visualizing as being forced upon Japan. In fact, a number of Japanese already had recognized that there was something to be gained from this kind of international relationship. And some of the people who were the harshest critics of the Bakufu, or the old shogunal domain, for surrendering to these treaties were also the same people who were taking advantage of them, cementing ties and relationships with Westerners, Western firms. British and Americans were in the forefront of this, and bringing new technology, bringing new ideas to Japan. So what has happened in the post-war period in Japan is not a new phenomenon at all. This kind of borrowing process that we see in the mid-19th century was simply a forerunner of today's change.
When we talk about the Meiji Restoration, the Emperor Meiji, who died in 1912.
Meiji, yes,
right?
1912.
Yes, and
1868.
Right, as it began very young as the emperor and in Japan. And evidently there were people behind the throne who were very interested in moving in these more open directions, saw a chance to modernize Japan, and I take it used the emperor as sort of a puppet for their aims.
Actually, the Meiji emperor was probably the foremost emperor, certainly in the last couple of centuries, in terms of his influence and ability. But you are right, Jim, there were a lot of people around him. It's one of those curious, I think, quirks of fate that in the mid-19th century, Japan was blessed by a number of very astute leaders who had thorough grounding in their history, their culture, their heritage, but confidence enough to open up and to be very curious and interested in the Western, in the modern, in the new, and they combine those two techniques in a vigorous way to produce a dynamic change, the likes of which I don't believe historically we see, at least very frequently.
Right. Maybe 1989 in Eastern Europe.
Could be a possibility.
There.
We need another 50 years perspective on that, however.
Spoken as a fine historian. So we're sort of in the 20th century, or approaching it, where they're moving into a constitutional kind of government that they have here. They have the Diet getting more power, the 1925, the franchise given to all adult males, and sort of this greater opening. And I guess after the World War I, again, they were in a position to have greater power in Southeast Asia or further as well.
Their power, their influence, politically, economically, militarily, grows, of course, in the latter part of the 19th and into the 20th century, and Japan is becoming more and more a world power. By the death of the Emperor Meiji, Japan is, I would estimate, one of the 7 or 8 most powerful nations in the world. Not the most powerful, obviously, but gaining increasing recognition. That recognition, however, did not come as fast as Japan had hoped, nor as extensively as she had hoped.
Let's talk now about the period between the two world wars and that led up to World War II. I mean, I take it that Japan felt some pressures to expand or some worries that they were in trouble. Well, go ahead.
She certainly felt all of these things, Jim. I guess in brief fashion, some of the things that I would emphasize here, Japan is a late modernizer, as is Germany. And a feeling had developed in their society pushing for expansion, pushing for what we might call imperialism. Japan saw that the Western powers, United States, more specifically Britain and France, had done this at an earlier period of time. She is beginning to do it now. She's also talking about a theme which is very popular in that part of the world, which is liberation, rescuing countries from white Western domination. The problem, of course, with this is that Japan becomes then the second dominator, and while the Vietnamese may wish to be rescued from the French, they don't necessarily want the Japanese to do it, and while the Burmese and the Malay and such may wish the same from Britain, Japan is not necessarily the partner they want to do that. So there are mixed signals coming there in that process. There's also the tremendous economic difficulties of the Depression and Japan being caught up in the international environment of world trade and such, something that she wasn't as familiar with nor as comfortable with as she would have liked to have been.
Okay, so, now we get sort of a military period, don't we? And
the 30s are certainly the military of the 30s, yes. Mm-hmm.
And which leads us then up. I guess the United States reacted to the Japanese expansionism by through trade and economic means. Of course, Japan, as we have to remember, is totally dependent upon the outside world for oil, for example.
Yes.
And I mean, I think that seems to play a role in all of this, the economics. I mean, we should remember that about Japan. I mean, not only is it an island, I mean, it's a rather small place. It's less than the size of California, and yet has a population half the size of the United States. I mean, it's unbelievable. And I think only 1/5 of the land is really subject to cultivation.
Actually, that's probably even high, 1/6.
So, I mean, just to give a feel of the economic problems that are faced, we've got this tremendous population, small land, and not much
the natural resources. Japan is one of the poorest countries in the world in terms of natural resources.
It's hard for people to believe they're such an economic giant without having these resources. But this helps, I think, understand the military expansionism of the period, and especially when we put pressure on them in terms of cutting off oil and so on.
It helps explain in one sense, but it also helps underline the importance of internationalism. Japan must exist in the international world. She can't exist separate from that international world. Her approach at solving problems militarily has been replaced by an approach to try and deal with the situation via international relations in a more favorable situation that way.
Now that brings us up to the outbreak of World War II then, and this sort of international view we're taking. Why don't we look at some of the causes of that and how we understand Pearl Harbor and so on.
It's a multi-causal feature, obviously. Pearl Harbor is a new event in the sense of Japanese development. She has been involved militarily in war with China and in East Asia for a decade before Pearl Harbor. For Japan, there are two currents running throughout her history of the 20s and 30s. There's the current of the militarist, which we've talked about just briefly, and which leads to Pearl Harbor and that. There's also the current of the internationalist. In the 1920s, one of her leading diplomats, a fellow by the name of Shirihara, gave a strong emphasis to working in favorable position with the rest of the countries of the world. She participated in the League of Nations. She participated in the Washington and the London naval conferences. She went to European conferences, 1925 in Locarno and other such things. Those two currents competed with each other, and in the 30s the military tended to take the upper hand. They took that because they felt that Japan's society was deteriorating. She was losing her values. In 1925, one of the big scandals was that Japan's culture was being corrupted by Western influence. They'd had movies, and they had seen a prolonged kiss on the movie screen, and something that was said to be decadent and destroying the Japanese values and cultures. So the ultranationalists, the militarists, pushed in favor of stronger international policy as well as stronger discipline and control at home. And that control factor is one of the major things, I think, that led Japan down the path to war. The opportunity to resist that, the opportunity to say no, Japan's need to fit within a certain model just was a problem there.
There's a great misunderstanding of Japan at this time in the American mind. I heard a very interesting lecture by a colleague of ours, Professor Al Cave, where he was analyzing the American response to Pearl Harbor. And one of the interesting things was that there was the absolute conviction among some people's mind that Japan would not attack the United States. They were seen as totally inferior, that their pilots could not fly properly and that they wouldn't know what to do. In fact, Al was telling stories of when the planes actually appeared over in Pearl Harbor, that the Americans thought it was a trick, that it was either an exercise or some other country was doing this bombing other than Japan. So there was, when we look at this relationship between the U.S. and Japan, there was tremendous stereotypical thinking in the United States, very often putting down these people. They were too small to fight in war. They were not bright enough. They couldn't fly planes. And he was putting this forward as a thesis for helping us understand, because there were reports out at the time, as he was saying, that to be on alert. That we should be on alert, and these the generals just couldn't see their way clear to expecting this attack from the Japanese.
I think what you're outlining, Jim, is a feature here of lack of understanding or appreciation for the Japanese culture and society. It's manifest in two different ways, I believe. The negative, the Japanese can't do that sort of thing that you're describing, and the opposite, imagining the Japanese as being super people.
Which is more in vogue now.
Yes, much more in vogue now, being able to accomplish magnificent things that such. Truly, we were not prepared psychologically for Pearl Harbor. We had grossly underestimated the Japanese capabilities, and that's a real mistake, because if we had have looked seriously, we would have seen the accomplishments of Japan for a half a century prior to this time, and what she had been able to accomplish vis-a-vis, for example, the battle with the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 should have told us that she has the capability, and she had advanced so far beyond that stage that we were simply caught off guard.
Yes. But, however, this was a strange gambit on the part of the Japanese. The possibilities of success were somewhat remote and were understood by major military figures in Japan.
Admiral Yamamoto, for instance, the man who planned it, was very familiar with American naval facilities. He was a friend of American naval personnel. He had studied here in this country. He advised Japanese policymakers against such an attack, because he said, at best, we may be able to wreak havoc and destroy the American naval fleet for up to a year. But after that period of time, the U.S. will come roaring back. Others, in a kind of think tank way, had pointed out that in terms of resources, in terms of armament, in terms of industrial capability, Japan could not win a war against the United States. But in an almost religious vein, there were people who said, but that does not take into account spirit. It does not take into account human will. We must, using a temple in Kyoto, throw ourselves off of Kiyomizudera and let the gods, let fate bear up and help determine.
It's part of that Japanese civil religion at work
again.
And we're the chosen people and a special people, and through this hard work and determination, we would be able to triumph. And of course, as we know, the American strategy was to isolate and eventually, by destroying their naval capabilities, they were not able to supply troops, and eventually, the winning of the war was inevitable.
The technological advantages the U.S. had in terms of air and sea power made the real difference there.
I think that takes us, to the way the war ended, and we go to 1945, August 6th, and the dropping of the atomic bomb, Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki. part of what I did, Bill, when I was in Japan was make a pilgrimage to Hiroshima, and I thought of it as a religious kind of pilgrimage, since we are the only country in the world that's ever used an atomic weapon against another country. And I went on one of those bullet trains to Hiroshima and finally arrived at the Peace Park there, and it's quite a moving experience as you walk in, and you have been there,
yes,
I know, and I just want to go back over that in a way that when you walk in there, there's that one surviving building that is propped up. Did you tell me one time it was a customs house? What was it?
It was the agricultural ministry.
Agricultural ministry, and I mean, that's out of all, it was a city of 350,000, as I remember, and when there, I, as you probably did, watch the movies that they show about the city before it was bombed. And what was remarkable to me was the city had not been bombed before. They were not used to it. And everything was going about very normally, and children outside playing. Yes. Everything seemed rather bright and rosy as they were showing the movies of the city before the bombing. And then suddenly at 8:15 in the morning, comes this blast that just changed everything and reduced it to rubble, and the people just decimated in the unbelievable heat. And then you see the pictures of the place afterwards, and the people with the radiation sickness and so on. It's just a remarkable experience.
The experience there is incredibly dramatic. I feel it should be required experience for all politicians, all leaders, and decision makers on an international level to see what actually happened in that environment and experience. And
they have that marvelous, I don't know, museum. It's almost grotesque in a way when you walk inside and you see the results of this bombing, and you see a little tricycle there just almost melted by the heat, and garments, and then that well-known picture of where a man was sitting in front of a wall and just was obliterated, and you just see the outline on the wall of the human figure.
Yes,
it's very striking.
It's extremely moving. I was there with my children. I've been there more than once, but there with my children, and it made such an impact upon them, such a moving experience.
Well, the one striking thing is the young woman who was dying, a young girl, I mean, I forget her exact age, 8 or 9, something like that, as I recall it. But she was in the hospital dying of radiation and was fighting against this and was making these cranes, a symbol of peace, folding paper into these cranes. And then they have this marvelous remembrance of her, a statue of her holding the crane aloft out in the Peace Park.
The origami, the folded crane memorial place there is one of the most touching. It certainly moved me being there with my children and seeing and remembering that experience.
Yes, the crane is a symbol of peace.
Yes, symbol of peace, and it's a symbol of longevity, and for people who are ill, a sign of hope and hopeful survival.
Yes, and then there's the cenotaph, as they call it, right in the sort of center of the park there, and in there are the names, as I recall
names
of the people who perished immediately, something like 100,000 or something?
And they add to that periodically those who die of the radiation, or who died, and I'm not sure they're still continuing to add the names. But
and what about that other, they call it the atomic pile? Is that the ashes of the people are buried?
Yes.
I really didn't understand that as
I'm not sure. I'm not sure of what you're referring to on that. There is one place that has the so-called epicenter where the bomb supposedly hit. I don't know if you're referring to that or...
Well, there was this big black mound, and I was told that the ashes of people that had perished were buried there.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that. I'm sorry.
But the point of it is that, I mean, this whole history of international relationships comes up to this situation of this atomic bombing that's the result of the war effort. And they take blame for it in some of their public statements that we began the war, we attacked Pearl Harbor, here's the cruel results of it. But you get this feeling in the park and in the city of Hiroshima of dedication to peace. We got to have peace in international relationships. A war like this can't be. We have these people called the hibakusha.
Hibakusha.
Yes,
those people damaged by the war, by the atomic bomb.
Right, and who go around the world at various times and preach a message of peace. And they're not violent, they're not angry, they're not upset. They simply don't want this ever to happen again.
Japan has become the leader in this, and I think we can shift into that mode here. In post-war Japan, the idea of nuclear allergy, the idea of anti-nuclear, anti-atomic has been a very strong and I believe a very sincere motive of a number of Japanese leaders. They have attempted now through peaceful means to rectify the damages that they caused in the war itself. Many Americans are skeptical of this because it appears to be such an incredible turnaround from the vicious banzai attacks from the military mode of the 30s and 40s. But I believe there's a sincerity there on the part of the Japanese. I believe they are trying to accomplish that. They have demonstrated it, for example, by opposing military armaments beyond the kind of minimal. Now, Japan has significant military armaments, but they are, as they claim, for defensive and not offensive purposes. They're strictly under civilian control. Japan's overall expenditures in military affairs has been limited to less than 1% of GNP. Only just very recently has it barely crept over that level. And when you compare it to the United States, it's spending 6-7% of our GNP on armaments. Japan is demonstrating and proving that you can be a success peacefully.
Well, Bill, I really appreciate all that knowledge and background you bring to this question. We're talking about Japan and international relationships. You've seen a history influence of China, and then the closing out of the Western world, and then an opening up again in the 19th and 20th century. Unfortunate military history, and then culminating in the terrible atomic bombing. But now producing a nation really, I think, dedicated to peace and international cooperation, because being a country without their own resources, they really are necessarily bound into the larger community of nations.